Hello and welcome to Line of Duty. I'm Joe Johnson, and as many of you probably know, there was a Valentine's Day shooting in Florida that really reignited the discussion about gun control and gun reform and how to handle these situations and prevent these situations in the future. And this is taking place all over the country. And today I wanted to kind of bring that issue here to Lake Orion and find out how that particular incident and others before it have affected the response and prevention methods here in Lake Orion. So joining me here today is Lieutenant Dan Toth of the Oakland County Sheriff's Office and Chief Jerry Narsh of the Lake Orion Police Department. And so we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about how Lake Orion has been affected by these national incidents. So the first thing I want to focus on, Lieutenant, is prevention. In the case of the Parkland shooting, they're finding out after the fact that there were a lot of warning signs and that he kind of put his intentions out there, and a lot of it was, I don't want to say ignored, but maybe not taken as seriously as it probably should have. And in the wake of this shooting, there have been copycat threats right here in Oakland County, where kids are putting threats out there, and maybe they're not aware of the consequences of their actions. Let's start off with that. Let's say there's a student out there, maybe elementary school, maybe high school, that becomes aware of a classmate who is making threats, either on social media or through conversations or texts. Let's go back to that starting point. What should a person do if they become aware of a classmate that might be making threats? How should that be handled? How seriously should that be taken?
So there's a lot of different ways to contact us and report, any potential violence. I don't think there's a right way, as long as we get notified, law enforcement is notified so we can follow up. So we had this discussion with the school liaison officer about the different mechanisms. Okay, this could, the state of Michigan has okay to say. Many times the students will discuss it with their siblings, friends, associates, parents. Oftentimes it may be a favorite teacher or a counselor that they may approach. And a lot of times they're just not sure, but something doesn't seem right, or there's, in many cases nowadays, there's an image that could be sent. And what we're seeing a lot of bullying, what we call cyberbullying, that kind of gets pushed to the edge, okay, unfortunately, with, with the electronics, the culture of electronics and cyberbullying. So I think in our community we're seeing a lot of that. So over the last 3 weeks we have had a dozen different investigations because it's heightened everyone's awareness of this. I mean, we prefer, and I'm sure Chief Narsh agrees, that we want to stay vigilant all the time. We don't want to wait for a particular incident where we become more aware. We want to stay heightened all the time, but this is the way, sometimes it takes these matters to remind everyone that there's a potential, for violence, in some of these communications. So they come in through the teachers, the parents. As long as it gets to law enforcement and we can follow up 24/7. So oftentimes, by the time we get it, it may be 2 p.m., 3 p.m., 4 p.m., but often it may be 10 p.m. or 11 p.m. or the middle of the night by the time it actually gets to law enforcement. So we're going to immediately initiate an investigation and make sure we're going to assess, the communication. If it's a cyber communication, whether it's written, it's verbal, it's a statement, we're going to assess it. We're going to make contact with everybody that's involved with it, and fully investigate it to the point where we're actually going to the homes and ensuring that there's not the means to carry out what may have been threatened or implied.
So with the evolution of technology, Chief, there's always new apps being downloaded. You know, kids were on Facebook until their parents started joining, and then they went and found something else. Do you find that handling these threats, handling these issues is constantly evolving as new technology emerges?
You know, it does. The technology is changing all the time. You know, it used to be Facebook was for young people. Now, my kids always joke that Facebook's for old people. They Snapchat and other things that I have no idea. So that challenge is always there, but what doesn't change is human nature. And the nature of kids and the emotions and the feelings and the way they respond to peer pressure, bullying. The other part of human nature that we're seeing in situations like this is, Lieutenant Toth mentioned that is when, right after a shooting, we keep it heightened. We're at this level up here, and everybody, whether it's a parent, a child, people that are watching the news, they're all looking and listening for this type of information that they could report to someone that this person is acting bizarrely. But you get a year or 6 months out from a mass shooting, and people tend to fall back into the comfort zone that they're seeing things that don't seem right, but they don't report them because it's going to be okay. The statistics that have shown from 2000 to 2014, the FBI analyzed every mass shooting. There's 160 shootings in that time period. And from then till now, the data shows that over 80% of these mass shootings, people knew. In this incident, clearly it was reported that both to law enforcement and to neighbors and friends that there was a problem here. And the most important thing is getting that information to law enforcement, and then for law enforcement to do an investigation and assessment, working with the schools or maybe their employer if it's a work-related situation, and determining whether a threat really exists and following that all the way through.
Okay.
It's difficult with each individual case is unique.
Let's talk consequences. So let's say a student breaks up with a girl and threatens her over social media. Law enforcement shows up at his doorstep and he says, I was just kidding. I didn't think anyone was going to take it seriously. And I think that's one of the problems with social media is young people aren't always aware of the consequences. What are the consequences that young people need to be made aware of, whether they intended on acting out on their threat or not? What are the consequences of making the threat? What do these young people need to be made aware of?
Well, the consequences could be a 20-year prison term.
Wow.
For a felony of a terrorist act. And I think you summed it up pretty good. It's not the person that's implying or making the threat, it's not up to them to decide whether it's real or not. It's really up to the receiver. It's somewhat like sexual harassment. It's up to the receiver, the people that are perceiving the threat, to size it up and assess it. And in this case, it's going to be parents and teachers, police officers, detectives, and prosecutors that are going to size up that threat. So that's what they really need to consider. It's not what they think, it's what others, how it's going to be perceived. That they really need to consider. So we want to remind everyone, like Chief Narsh said, when the emotions are high, and especially with youth, okay, or whether it's a relationship, could be children or adults for this matter, but before you hit send, pause, get up out of your chair, take a walk for 20 minutes, and think about what, what are the consequences? What's going, when you send that signal out, what's going to come back? And typically what we find, the police are going to come back to your front door. And every electronic signal, if you will, that's sent out leaves a fingerprint. And we will come back to your front door. Okay, it's difficult to run away from the social media posts.
I read something recently that someone had scrawled a message in a bathroom stall, and somehow law enforcement was able to get back to that student who had written a message on a stall. So I imagine you have to take those just as seriously as a text message.
You do. And, you know, there's video surveillance, if not fixed surveillance, somebody next to you with a cell phone that's recording on just about everything now. And to a lot of extent, that's good. Law enforcement uses that in our investigations all the time. And I wish more people would understand what they're doing and where they are is being recorded, and perhaps they would change their behavior. And that's the level that these investigations have to go to. And unfortunately, when you see a situation like in Florida or another school or a McDonald's or a theater, there always seems to be that bounce back of reaction from, I don't want to blame it always just on mental health issues or people who are unstable, who feel that in some way, shape, or form they're not being listened to, or that society doesn't care for them. There's certain traits that seem to be common throughout that, but they tend to duplicate around a mass incident like that, and everybody is kind of hypersensitive. You know, there's two types of that threat communication that law enforcement gets involved in. There's and I hate to say it this way, but the everyday threat, where relationships fail, and they can be adults, or it could be somebody at work or another friend, and you have a soured relationship and they'll threaten each other. Social media has just become the way that the telephone used to be, where they'd call and argue and fight. Now they text it back and forth. We're going to look at those as an individual threat upon each other, but we're still going to investigate those threats. Then you have the individuals who are going to make a threat or an implied threat to a mass environment. And that is, Lieutenant Toth mentioned a 20-year felony. Those, if you've watched recently, those people that are making those threats to a large mass of people in a school or a public facility, they're being charged, and they're in $1 million bond. And that's going to follow a 17 or an 18-year-old for the rest of their lives. And an adult who makes those threats, there is now the using a computer to commit harassment, the cyberbullying crime, if you will. You know, that's a 5-year felony. And if, as Dan mentioned, if you, the receiver, feels threatened, terrified, annoyed, harassed, that's going to launch an investigation. And what used to be just a reaction out of an emotional experience is now a crime.
Right.
Don't use the device, don't use the computer. Be careful before you say it, but careful before you send it, because it may follow you the rest of your life.
Right. Now, in keeping with our theme of prevention, let's talk about the parent's responsibility. A lot of times, a lot of these incidents happen because the shooter gets easy access to weapons that might be kept in a home that aren't necessarily locked up or something like that. What is a parent's responsibility when you have a young person living in the home? Talk about that. What's a parent's responsibility to try to prevent these types of things from happening?
You know, if you look at our automobiles, I sometimes use this analogy. We have all these safety features in our vehicles, seat belts and airbags and alarms, and yet a lot of our homes are low tech, but there's a lot of hazards in our homes. We highly recommend that if you have firearms in your home, you should use a safe, a regular safe, not a locked file cabinet, because that's it's just not appropriate for firearms. You need to keep firearms locked up, and especially in a home with children and teenagers, anyone like that. And when we have contact under these circumstances with parents, we highly suggest that they consider removing the firearms from the home if you have a situation in your home where emotional or mental health or substance abuse could be a factor. You know, you may want to consider temporarily removing the firearms from the home instead of staying up, you know, all night worrying about it. Just remove that from the home. And I think that people need to understand there are a lot of partnerships. There are a lot of avenues for help. You know, if you have someone in your home that's experienced some mental health issues, you can reach out. There's a lot of organizations in Oakland County. You can start out by any of the police stations, but just reaching out, and it's not one of these secrets that you have to, you know, keep in your home. We all reach this point where we need help, you know, and we can't find it from within, and we have to, you know, step out of our homes and, you know, our family environments and reach out to different resources that we have. And I think that's important, and I think that possibly that could have been a factor in the recent shooting in Parkland, Florida.
Just last year, I think we did a news story on the police department offering to residents the use of the department's gun safe. Do you want to talk about that?
Sure. There were some questions whether, you know, the police are going to keep my gun safe while I'm on vacation, and is this just a registration program? Honestly, no. Local law enforcement doesn't set state policy on you know, who possesses and has a firearm. What we wanted to do, and a lot of police departments are doing a similar program, is just something that if you're going to go on vacation or out of town, bring those firearms down. We've got a large facility for that. We're going to lock those up. We're going to keep them safe. They're separate from, you know, the evidence weapons and things like that. We're going to lock those up and keep those safe, because remember, 100% of the guns stolen in a home invasion are now used in a crime. 100%. Well, the first crime is they were stolen in a home invasion.
Right.
So we know they're fruit of a crime. Those are the guns that are going to make their way to the street. They're going to make their way into the hands of someone where there is no control, there is no parental control or access. So the more we can do to make guns safe and keep them out of the hands of criminals, that's job one. Job two is obviously securing them from other family members. If you're going to go out of town and you don't have a secure facility, just as Lieutenant Toth had mentioned, if you don't have a safe, and let us at least hold those for you while you're out of town if there's other family members using that home, so you know your firearms are secure. It's that simple. And if not, the really secure safes have become very inexpensive. And if I think everybody in law enforcement has that same philosophy, is if you're going to have firearms in the home, you might not have children in the home, but you're going to have friends over and neighbors over. There's going to be children and young people in the home. Buy a safe. There's great fast response by touch that will allow a home defense gun to be used quickly in the event they need them, but they're still secure and locked away from people who shouldn't have them. And it's not really that expensive, and personally I think it's a good investment if you own firearms, is to have the safety aspect too.
Okay. Now let's talk about prevention at the school level. You both told me that it's up to the district to create policy as far as how they handle prevention at the school. So really, prior to an event happening, your role is pretty much education, right? And just trying to educate people. So do you want to touch on that a little bit, the responsibility of prevention on school grounds?
Well, I think first off, when the school has internal policies, but they do work with us, and we do sit down, and we sat down, we have discussed resources, and we have assessed. We've been to every one of these schools. We've done the security walkthroughs. We've done the assessments, security assessments. And when we go into the school, we're looking at an all hazards response, okay? Not just, active shooter, but we work with them on you know, outside. So a lot of times what we've discussed with the schools is this 3 rings of security. You know, the inside of the school would be your inner ring. Just outside, the exterior doors would be your second ring, and the parking lot and the adjacent property would be the 3rd ring, okay? And I know that the Lake Orion schools, they've improved the audio-video security cameras on that outside ring. The middle ring, which would be the exterior doors, they have limited access controls, and the schools are locked down much of the day, okay? And then obviously inside the school there's camera and trained staff members and security. So we've sat down with the school over the years. We're just not now. I mean, we've been doing this for years, but it seems like, you know, like Chief Narsh says, every time there's a shooting, the awareness, it gets heightened again, and for the right reasons. We want to evaluate what's changing, what's changed. So security does evolve with the incidents that we're seeing. So like Parkland, Florida, the fire alarm was pulled. That wasn't the first time it was pulled. At Columbine it was pulled too. So we're evaluating those changes in these in all the public buildings, not just the schools, but the shopping malls, the schools, churches, businesses.
In Parkland, there was some criticism of some of the deputies that were stationed at the school, and I guess some of the responding deputies. And I don't know if all that criticism is necessarily fair or not. You have to look at the situation. How often do your officers and your deputies train and prepare? I mean, like you said, every situation is different. But how often do you prepare for this situation for an eventuality?
Well, and we do train, and not to address specifically Parkland, Florida, but let's talk about what we do in Oakland County, Michigan. And we jointly train, for the most part, law enforcement across the nation uses a standardized response protocol for an active shooter or a critical incident. And with that, we're going to not only train together along with fire departments and emergency medical responders at these incidents, but we're going to train based on information that we receive from the last critical incidents or mass shootings. So that type of information is constantly fed back into the training protocols, and this isn't just every couple of years. This is several times throughout the year that officers refresh either on the type of information that comes out of a mass shooting or the actual training that we're doing. In Oakland County, there's it's called OCTAC, Emergency Response. Every police agency in Oakland County is a part of that, and it is a single thought process protocol response for mass incidents, not just active shooters. And within the individual agencies and then combined, everybody is training, everybody is prepared. Law enforcement and military always train their staff so that when they arrive at an incident, they not only know what to do, they respond based on their training. So that training has to be ongoing, it's got to be relevant, it's got to be updated, and that takes place in Oakland County throughout the year. And I guess from an assurance standpoint, this is probably one of the strong suits of our county and our law enforcement agency is that we do train and we are prepared, and we are going to respond, and we're going to respond quickly and with sufficient force to neutralize that threat.
Anything you can add to that? What can you say to the parents and teachers and students of Lake Orion to try and reassure them that that the Oakland County Sheriff's Office is ready to go?
Well, number one, I think if you look at the data that comes out of Oakland County is one of the safest counties in the nation. The residents in Orion Township and the village of Lake Orion live in one of the safest communities in the state. Okay, our response is layered. Okay, in other words, the first car that arrives at the scene, that car is the contact team, okay? And it may be 2 officers, and it may be 4 officers, but we can tell you that we can put 50 officers on the scene of any type of incident in Oakland County within minutes. And I think as an example, just this past fall when there was a gas line rupture, and we're able to get that type of scene straightened out in a matter of just a few minutes. And there were 30 officers, there's 30 EMS and fire personnel on scene. So, and from multiple agencies. So, and I think that's what Chief Narsh is saying, is that it's a layered response. And in fact, we don't wait. If you think about it, every domestic assault that we go to, all these calls that we go to, or many of them, okay, we have to be prepared, okay, and trained that that's a potential threat, okay, with firearms. So really every week we are going to these calls with the understanding that firearms are involved, okay. We'd like to know what's on scene, but when we go to family trouble calls or the variety of calls, we go with 1 car and 2 car and 3 cars, and we suspect that things could be elevated, and it may not, when we get there, it may not be what we were first notified initially. So we're always preparing, we're always in that mode that things could escalate, but we really inherently do it daily in our duties. That preparedness factor that goes into many of these violent scenes, any scene with violence.
Right. And I want to, if I can, I want to pony on to what Dan just said, Lieutenant Toth just said, is that layered response. And you had asked the question, how does that help the viewers at home know what we're doing and how safe they are? When those first officers arrive on the scene, those officers aren't going to, of an active shooter scenario, they're not going to sit back and wait to assess. They're going to go inside. They're going to immediately go inside, and their job is to locate, identify, and neutralize the threat. As the responding officers, and this is where we train together and we train the same, is the responding officers, it doesn't matter what department they're coming from, we're all supporting each other. Everyone knows based on who's there and who's coming what the next layer is going to do. So that is a combined, it is a coordinated, and it is a well-trained effort. And that fast response, that layered response, provides for an additional level of safety and a fast response level of safety for any incident that happens in our community.
Well, hopefully our law enforcement will never have to respond to a situation in Oakland County. Hopefully with emphasis on prevention, we can try to keep these things from happening. And you guys go into the schools, you talk to staff and faculty and students, and I think with that kind of an effort, hopefully we'll educate our young people, teach them about the consequences of their actions, and try to prevent these things from happening as opposed to responding to them. So I'd like to thank both of you for coming down today, and I think it was a great discussion and lots of great information, and you'll see these gentlemen at your local school and spreading the word. And so thank you very much for joining me, and thank you for watching Line of Duty. We'll see you next time. Good night.